Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbart Gaming. My last video of 2023 was a complete playthrough with commentary of the surprisingly decent Game Boy version of Contra III, called Contra the Alien Wars. My first video of 2024, which you're watching right now, is another episode of utterly pointless comparisons, where I'll be looking at a few more versions of Contra III. Kinda. You may think that Contra Advance, the Alien Wars EX on the Game Boy Advance, is just a simple downsized SNES port to the GBA like so many other titles early in that system's life. And if you do think that, well, you're wrong! You see, the GBA version of Contra the Alien Wars EX has 6 levels. 4 of them are from SNES Contra III the Alien Wars, and 2 of them are from the Genesis title Contra Hardcorps. I'll be comparing Contra Advance the Alien Wars EX to both of those original games. Normally I'd take a look at the specs here, but for this kind of unique comparison that makes less sense. I'll talk about tech differences during the comparison itself. So let's switch about the game before we get started, or games. Contra III the Alien Wars for the Super Nintendo came out at the end of February '92 in Japan, and a month later in the US. Really, it's the 4th game in the series, since Contra, Super Contra, and Operation C for the original Game Boy all preceded it, and there are betas of the game out there with the title Contra IV the Alien Wars. Contra 3 felt more like an evolution of the 8-bit titles than a continuation of the arcade series, with similar design sensibilities to both NES titles. It just used the vastly superior capabilities of the Super Nintendo to show more sprites, effects, and of course, Mode 7 for 2 overhead stages in levels 2 and 5. This won't be a popular opinion, but I view Contra 3 as a good, but not great game, and it's not my favorite in the series. But it looked and sounded fantastic when it was new, there's no doubt about that. Contra Advance, the Alien Wars EX, was released for the Game Boy Advance early in its life cycle, back in November of 2002. It's mostly a conversion of Contra 3, and I was looking forward to playing this game after it was revealed. Contra Advance is a great life lesson in that sometimes it's better to want a thing than to actually get it. Frankly, it's a poor port of 4 levels from Contra 3, mashed up with the poor port of 2 levels of Contra Hardcorps from the Genesis. You see, they decided to remove the overhead levels from the SNES original game and replace them with 2 levels from Hardcorps instead, and they just don't gel with the other levels here. Personally, I think some other levels from Contra Hardcorps would have been a better fit. Speaking of Contra Hardcorps for the Genesis came out in the US in October of 1994. It was kind of a weird take on Contra, and for me, marks where the real decline of the series started. Now don't get me wrong, it has some great action set pieces and effects, but the dialogue scenes slow the action down tremendously, and in most stages the level design just has you moving from one mini-boss to the next, with few to no regular enemies in between. And some of you will yell at me for this one, but I hate the branching paths, and would rather have just had fewer but better designed levels. I also think Konami really dropped the ball with the soundtrack in this one. Now I don't hate it, I like Contra Hardcorps, but I was disappointed by it, and I view it as just a good game, and I think it's outclassed by other similar games on the system. The feel of Contra Hardcorps is pretty similar to Contra 3, which is why Konami, I'm sure, decided to pluck a few levels out of this one to plop into Contra Advance. Sorry for the longer than usual setup. As for recording methodology, I use save states in each game, of course, because they're all hard AF, and I didn't want to slow down the video with a bunch of deaths. Just know that I died plenty in game, and I'm not trying to hide it. Alright, let's get on with it. And we are underway. So as you can see, first of all, the resolution on these two systems is vastly different. Contra 3 the Alien Wars on the Super Nintendo runs in its standard 256 by 224 resolution. Meanwhile, Contra Advance runs at 240 by 160, which is just the only Game Boy Advance resolution. Aside from that, I'm sure you've noticed the extra bright colors in Contra Advance, and a big reason for that is, if you aren't aware, the original version of the Game Boy Advance did not have any backlighting, and you had to put it basically under a lamp that was as bright as the sun in order to be able to see the screen. To help alleviate that issue, a lot of companies used brighter visuals than they would have used in other systems, so much brighter colors. Now the other thing you'll notice here right from the get-go is that the characters are a lot bigger and occupy much more of the screen in the Game Boy Advance version. Part of that is the resolution difference, and part of it is they just kind of took a lot of the graphics straight out of the Super Nintendo original without really scaling them for the difference in the screen size. So It's easy to redo graphics that way, because you could just take them and put them in. All they had to do was really recolor them. But it hurts the game overall, because all the sprites, all your characters and everything are just too big. It gives this game on Game Boy Advance a very cramped feel. And another thing you'll notice gameplay-wise, and this is infuriating, they took away the ability to have 2 weapons at the same time. So on the Super Nintendo, you have 2 weapon slots, and you can switch between them at will with a button on the controller. In Contra Advance, you can only have 1 weapon at a time, and you switch between weapons by picking up a new one, and then the old one pops out of you and remains on screen for a bit, a la Castlevania Symphony of the Night with its sub-weapon system. And it's really annoying because there are parts in Contra 3 where it's really handy to be able to switch to a different weapon type to deal with specific situations, and in this game, you're stuck with 1. Like, the spread gun overall is not super great in Contra 3, but in, the Game Boy Advance version, I often kind of feel the need to stick with it because it's a good general all-purpose weapon, when there are times where it'd be much better to use something else. And you may not have noticed it there, but the fire that passed overhead in that little arc, it actually slows down on the Game Boy Advance. Keep in mind the Super Nintendo is a 16-bit system. Its CPU runs at a maximum of 3.58 megahertz. Meanwhile, the Game Boy Advance is a 32-bit system that runs much faster. So, just seeing any slowdown at all in this Game Boy Advance game is really unacceptable. And as we fight the first boss here, here's another thing that's missing. There's no bombs in the Game Boy Advance version of Contra 3. They took the bombs out. And as you fight the boss, you'll notice he doesn't have that weird mosaic effect, and it doesn't sway with the pixels sliding up and down like it does on the Super Nintendo game. Instead, it has a much simpler effect where it just kind of rotates a little bit. And this is a section where, exactly what I was talking about with the weapons, it would have been handy to have, maybe the Crusher here to fire your exploding bullets, at the heart of your big rock turtle monster here. Without them, having the spread gun, which is really helpful to deal with the multitude of little enemies that it shoots out sometimes, you're just stuck taking way longer on this boss than it should. Another thing I'll note is for Super Nintendo Contra 3, I'm playing it on the hardest difficulty, not to show how awesome I am, but it's the only way to see the full game on that one. You don't see the last boss unless you play on the hardest difficulty, and you don't get the full ending unless you do that either. So here we can see when we get our mission clear screen, our level clear, completely different in both games. The Game Boy Advance only ever uses that one picture between levels. Now here we are switching over to Contra Hardcorps on the left side for the Genesis. And here you can see a lot of those, little cutscenes with dialogue that I was complaining about in the introduction to this. I left them in here so you can see what they're like and how long they are. Now, on the Genesis, you'll notice here that you can have 4 weapons at a time and switch between them, and it also has bombs. It's really weird that they took the bombs out of the Game Boy Advance version of the game. And this level also, with that hallway at the beginning on the train, really shows you just how cramped and claustrophobic this Game Boy Advance version of Contra is. Another thing I'd like to point out is that the explosions in Genesis Contra Hardcorps are way more kinetic than the explosions we see in the Game Boy Advance Contra Advance. And I know at least one time I died when this boss was crawling along on the floor in the Game Boy Advance version. I've never had that happen in Contra Hardcorps on the Genesis. Now, and once again, we have the much brighter colors. I'd also say that in the Genesis version of Hardcorps here, the parallax is just a lot smoother. It just has a much more pleasant look. And it's not just because the colors are darker. And I'd say this level, just in general, in Contra Hardcorps in the Genesis, this is the second to last level in its path that you take. Meanwhile, here in Contra Advance, on the Game Boy Advance, it's the very second level in the game. And the boss on this level that we're going to see is really much too difficult for a second level boss in a Contra title. And you can learn it and you can deal with it, but it does not have an appropriate difficulty ramp up. It goes hard way too fast. And the other thing I'll point out here is the bullets that the enemies fire in Contra Advance are really big, and they shoot them at different intervals than they do in the other versions of the games that it's based on. And here's another thing we're going to see. This is one of the coolest bosses in Contra Hardcorps for the Genesis, which is why I'm guessing they decided to include this level in the first place. We have this awesome, super multi-jointed animated robot. Konami was the king of multi-jointed enemy sprites. They were awesome at that stuff back in the day. Very oddly here on the Genesis, if you were looking, it basically took out a column of tiles on the left before it started doing this effect. I'm sure a Genesis programmer could explain to me why that happens, but I'm not quite sure. I don't know if that was necessary to do something, and look, it stretches back and fills up the whole screen again after that. One other thing I'll point out here is the big giant robot. You'll notice the animation is a lot less smooth on the Game Boy Advance version, which again is insanity. This thing is so much more powerful than the Genesis. Why isn't the animation smooth? And when the robot fires along the ground, you saw that in Contra Hardcorps, we get a big burst of flames that slides across the ground. Meanwhile, in Contra Advance, it's just a little fireball that goes along the ground with a little tail on it like a comet. Huge, huge change there. And once again, being able to have different weapons would have made this fight a lot more, a lot quicker, number one, and a lot easier to deal with. And I'm not using any kind of cheats. If you duck in that left corner, the robot will never hurt you. If you're standing up when you go there, you will die. This fight in particular, on the Game Boy Advance, I died so many times doing it because of the super weird and awful hitboxes it uses. Something I hadn't mentioned yet that I really need to get to. Oh, another thing I want to mention here, that I kind of missed because there's so much to talk about with this, is the music in the level itself that you heard on the Game Boy Advance is the music from the second level of Contra 3. It is not the same music from Contra Hardcorps for this level which you heard. And that level music, it just does not fit here. And the boss music, in Genesis Contra Hardcorps for that boss is way better also. Meanwhile, on Contra Advance, it just uses the standard Contra 3 boss music for that encounter. Alright, level 3. So as this begins, let's talk a little bit about hitboxes. Your hitbox is approximately, 80% the size of the screen in this game. It's ridiculous. If enemies look at you the wrong way, you fall over and die in Contra Advance. It's much different than either Contra 3 or Contra Hardcorps, which have completely reasonable and what I would say are normal hitboxes. And it's a real problem in this game, especially because of how cramped the screen is. I mean, you'll get hit by enemies that you'll swear you never touched, and you're probably right, you probably didn't touch them. Now, as far as music goes, since I haven't talked about it too much yet, for Contra 3, the songs that are translated, to Contra Advance are not bad, they're alright, but this is from a time before, Konami and other companies had figured out you can squeeze more sound channels into the Game Boy Advance's 2 digital sound channels than just the 2 hardware ones that are in there. So later games, especially things like, Castlevania Aria of Sorrow, have much better sounding soundtracks overall. For Contra Advance, it's using those 2 digital channels, but it's also mixing them with standard Game Boy sound more often. So we're left with a much lower fidelity soundtrack than we had in the Super Nintendo original. Now, I can't compare it for you to, Contra Hardcorps on the Genesis, because it doesn't translate any of the songs from that game. While it borrows 2 of the levels, it doesn't use their music, and it doesn't use the boss music. It replaces it with music from the levels that were removed from Contra 3 in both cases. Now you'll notice on this section here, as we're climbing up with this machine following us, it happens way faster. We get to a stopping point way quicker in Game Boy Advance Contra the Alien Wars EX. On the Super Nintendo, this part lasts for a while. There's also a decent amount of slowdown here if you look at it on the Super Nintendo. Basically, every time I fire my flamethrower, the game slows down. And here we are with this boss fight, mini boss fight, which feels a lot different on the Game Boy Advance. They toned it down because of how cramped the area is. You barely have any space to move up and down. So they made this mini-boss, much slower and much easier to deal with. There I am firing one of those bombs in the Super Nintendo version that were so mercilessly removed from the Game Boy Advance game. Here we are defeating it on the Game Boy Advance also, and we're headed up, and the rest of this part is roughly around the same length. And here's one part where they pretty much got it right. Visually, the only real differences here are, the color palettes used. And again, on the Game Boy Advance, that was done so people could see it better in lower light situations on the original hardware. We still have the nice little transparency effect, since that's well within the capabilities of the Game Boy Advance. And I actually, on the Game Boy Advance, stretched this fight out a little bit. I was trying to match roughly the amount of time it took me to win on the Super Nintendo version, so I could get something similar on the Game Boy Advance. I got it pretty close, but not quite exactly right. These are the things you have to think about when you do these videos. So as we head in here onto the intersection, it looks like, there's a loss of detail in some of these tiles in the background, which we'll see that every now and then in this version for Contra Advance. But overall, it looks right, it plays right for the most part, aside from the things that were removed. There is one thing they added to Contra the Alien Wars EX control-wise that I didn't mention yet, and that is it's got a strafe button. So on Super Nintendo Contra 3, you can use either shoulder button to lock your firing position into place, so you can stand still and then fire on any angle. So you can do that with the right shoulder button on the Game Boy Advance still, that's there. The Game Boy Advance adds to the left shoulder button the ability to strafe. So you can lock in whatever your firing angle is, and then walk and move in any direction. And it's nice that it's there, and you can use it, but it doesn't really affect the gameplay all that much. I would rather have had, say, the bombs in here, or the ability to switch weapons. Would much rather have had the ability to switch weapons, actually. And you can see, if you look carefully here, on Game Boy Advance, what they do with the resolution a lot, the resolution difference, is just cut off parts of the screen on the top or bottom, or even left and right. And that does happen here. And you'll notice these flames are way faster on the Super Nintendo version on the left, but that's because of the difficulty level that I'm playing on, since I'm playing on hard. If you're playing on normal, the flames are not nearly so fast. They're more similar to what we see in the Game Boy Advance one, just so you don't hold that against it. And again, you can really feel just how cramped and claustrophobic this is. For the big alien skeletal robot, his head is so big on the Game Boy Advance version on the right that it doesn't quite fit in the little room that he's in. Meanwhile, over on the Super Nintendo, you can see there's a gap between the top of his head and the top of that room. So again, that's another sacrifice they had to make. And that also happens on the bottom, where you can see almost the start of his pelvis, practically. You don't get any of that at all in the Game Boy Advance version. And also on the Super Nintendo, you can see every time you clear a level, they have a different picture. And like I mentioned at the beginning, on Game Boy Advance, they use the same one every time. So here we have our cycle level. It says Stage 4 in both versions of the game. Now this may look tricky, and you may wonder how you could possibly do this, especially at these speeds. If you look at the speeder bikes in the air, the hover ones, the ones that are completely horizontal fire grenades at you, and the ones that are tilted down fire sort of those machine gun shots. So you know to jump if you see one that's completely straight overhead. And you can see the firing patterns of the enemies completely different in both games. On the Game Boy Advance one here, you probably don't even see an enemy fire. Yeah, you don't see any of those little flying guys get a shot off. When they do, it does happen sometimes. The shots are very big, and it's very tough to avoid them, and they're kind of slow. Also noteworthy here is that on the Super Nintendo, the entire screen bobs up and down while you're riding the cycle, and that does not happen at all on the Game Boy Advance. And for the big ship here, you can see that a lot of the ship itself is cut off on the top of the screen. We can see a lot more of it on the Super Nintendo original. And for this stupid multi-segmented thing made out of balls, on the Game Boy Advance, it's so cramped, it's really hard to get past that without getting hit. You gotta really time it right. Much easier to avoid on the Super Nintendo original. And this part coming up here is also another kind of a really big difference gameplay-wise for feel. For the big gun that we're coming up to on the left as we scroll in that direction, in the Super Nintendo, it's easy to goad it into firing at you, so you can easily go in front of it and avoid it. On the Game Boy Advance, No matter how many times I tried, I was not able to make it do that. Now here's an oddity. This is a sprite that they actually redrew and resized. I guess they felt that at its normal height it would have just taken up too much of the screen and they would have had to have altered the way that it works too much. And it's just, if Konami could redraw that one, they could have redrawn all the other sprites. It would have been so much better for them to redraw the things and have them be a proportional screen size so that we could more, comfortably play the game without feeling like we're occupying so much of the screen with such a giant main character. You'll see here the helicopter on Game Boy Advance is a lot more squat. It's not nearly as wide. Of course, the color's brighter, but again, that was just to compensate for the screen issues with the Game Boy Advance. Another thing I haven't pointed out is, as far as sound effects go, the explosions sound way different on Game Boy Advance. If we look at these missiles, they dramatically shortened them, but they also shortened the amount of time it takes to reach the boss of this level. So on the Super Nintendo, you gotta prove that you can survive these missiles and leap easily from one to another for quite a while before you even reach the boss. And no, the spread gun's not the ideal weapon here on Super Nintendo, but since I was using it, and I knew I was going to be using it on the Game Boy Advance, I tried to stick with it on this one. Now, I do use a lot of bombs here, so you can see, just how big a difference they can make. It makes, if you save them up, taking out this boss on the Super Nintendo pretty easy, and this is a great place to use those bombs if you're playing on hard on the SNES game. And what weapons might you want to have here? Well, the Crusher or the homing shots are a lot better to fight this thing. And this is another one that they resized quite a bit for the Game Boy Advance version, which is appropriate. You can see that your character, in the Super Nintendo one, it's quite a bit smaller than that sensor in the middle. Meanwhile, our character, in the Game Boy Advance, is quite a bit larger than that sensor in the middle of the ship. So proportions are just all out of whack, and it really gives this game a super weird feel, especially if you're used to the original. And just so you know, after this level, we'll be switching back over to Contra Hardcorps on the Genesis on the left. And this was another really weird level choice to choose from Contra Hardcorps to include in this game, and I'll explain why in just a moment as we get into it. So, one of the most annoying things about Hardcorps, like I said, are all those dialogue scenes. They slow things down a lot, right? I'm not going to beat a dead horse. I said it already. I said it a couple of times. I'm mentioning it now because this level from Contra Hardcorps that we're about to start here has several dialogue scenes, which makes it a particularly weird one to include. The level itself, this is the last level in this path on Contra Hardcorps. This is the final level where we'll defeat the final boss for this pathway. And as a final level in that game, I don't really even think it works great, because there's not many enemies in it. You have a few at the beginning here, and then after that, it's just sort of a little boss gauntlet where we fight 3 bosses in a row. So in the Genesis, we have this big dialogue scene where we have a meeting with a character. If we left him alive, will talk to us and taunt us. And they actually changed the way this boss works on the Contra Advance version. As you can see, you just blow the legs off instantly. Meanwhile, in Contra Hardcorps, you've got to blast this thing over and over and over again. And then the legs don't blow up one at a time. They start getting faster and it's tougher to avoid. But of course, that game has an extra move in it, the slide, which you're invincible during, which we do not have, at all in Contra Advance. Now, the Genesis form of this boss, Genesis version of this boss, as you can see here, has a second form that is not in Contra Advance. Now, on Genesis, there's 3 forms total, so this is the second of 3. On the Game Boy Advance version, we have the first form, or an approximation of it, and then the third form. We jump straight to that. And here we go. We're back in sync in just a second here. And as you can see, it's a lot slower on Game Boy Advance. It's way easier to avoid, that second attack. On the Genesis, you can avoid it without sliding, but it's a lot easier if you do. So here's dialogue scene number 2 in this level already. And yeah, for me, I hate having these things in the middle of fast action games like this. It just wrecks them for me. If you want to have them as skippable things between levels, I'm alright with that. But man, I hate it when they stop the action and do this. Here's dialogue scene number 3 in this level already on Contra Hardcorps. I mean, does anyone really care about the stories in these games? I know I don't. And yeah, we can see this boss works a lot differently in both games again. Way slower on the Game Boy Advance, and he's missing like half of his attacks. So they dumbed this down and made it really easy. And in fact, this is so much easier that it would have made more sense to have this as level 2 in Contra Advance and the train level as level 5. Because this level is much easier than that one. On the Genesis, you can see we're still going here. It's going to be a while. And man, he's wily and quick once he's running around and skittering along those walls. And if you didn't know, for Contra Hardcorps on Genesis, aside from the branching paths and stuff like that, you've also got 4 different characters you can choose between that have different weapons. So there's a lot of variety in it at least, so I give it points for that. And then here is, what was that, our 4th dialogue scene in the middle of this level already? So in Contra Hardcorps, during this path, this is our final boss. He's got, I think, 3 different forms total to contend with. We'll see if I remember that right. And again, so much easier on the Game Boy Advance version of the game. On the Genesis, it is harder, which is much more appropriate since it is, you know, the final stage. And I'll also add, in case you didn't know, Contra Hardcorps on the Genesis is one of the most insanely difficult games you'll ever play. The Japanese version of Contra Hardcorps gives you a life bar where you can take 3 hits before you die. For the American version, they took that life bar out, and you die in 1 hit, which makes the game tremendously tougher. Basically, it cuts the amount of lives you get in 1/3, and you lose your weapons a lot easier. So our second form of the boss here, which, sorry I talked over this part, but those heads, if you saw them moving on the Game Boy Advance, way choppier than the Genesis version. They came out, you know, 16, 17 years earlier. Maybe more, I didn't check my math. I forget the exact release dates. Not really relevant. Came out a long time before it. We're almost done with this second form in Hardcorps. There we are. Now here's our final form, and look how much cooler this looks on the Genesis version. And it just works and does so many different things, and it's a much more intense fight. It's really hard to avoid those heads that lash out in both versions of the game. On the Game Boy Advance, it's because of how cramped the screen is, even though they don't spread out nearly as much. Because while you don't see me die in this game, which, again, isn't because I'm trying to disguise my deaths, I've told you about them. I didn't want to slow things down because of losing weapons and having bosses take longer to beat and everything. So, with this thing, I died many times during it because I kept getting nicked and killed from places where it looked like it didn't touch me. So you've got to be really careful and be like a mile away from it every time to ensure you don't get hit. The exception being right there, because once you send it into its death state, the collision is switched off and it doesn't hurt you. So thus ends Stage 5 and our last stage from Hardcorps. Now we're back over to Super Nintendo Contra 3, The Alien Wars, and the last level, it was basically the same between the 2 games here. So if you remember when I showed you the regular Game Boy version of this game, they have this alien encounter, which is similar to what we see in the last level of the original Contra, both in the arcade and on NES. They repeat that little monster head 3 times. Meanwhile, in these versions of the game, we have sort of 3 distinct, unique bosses instead. And there's actually even more than that, but that's what it replaced for the most part. And yeah, these little heads, they sort of call into memory the things that were at the last level of the original arcade and NES Contra. Also, they're a little more aggressive in this one because they fire 3 projectiles out at you instead of just 1. And then here's another familiar scene to fans of the original Contra. This is the final boss from the first Contra, a beating alien heart. Only in the arcade version it had, I think, 6 pods. Can't remember if it's 6 or 8, I'd have to go back and check. You can look at my video where I compare NES and arcade Contra if you want to see for sure. And you'll notice those little scorpion-like enemies that were popping out way slower on the Game Boy Advance than they were in the Super Nintendo original. For regular difficulty on the Super Nintendo original, I don't remember if they're slower. They probably are, but I haven't played it on regular difficulty, since the game was new, since I like to make it to the end when I play and see full endings of games. Now here's another enemy that they did redraw. This enemy, if you didn't know, was the final boss in the regular NES version of Super C, which was its port of Super Contra. It does not appear in the arcade original Super Contra. It was unique to the NES version of the game. So it shows up there and it shows up here. And the difficulty is roughly the same in the 2 versions for this boss. That one doesn't really feel any different, so good on them for that. And this is another section in the Game Boy Advance version. They kind of trimmed how much you have to climb, just a tiny little bit. And the boss itself, kind of a pain, especially with your hitbox on the Game Boy Advance. You've got to make sure you're a million miles away from that tail. If it's even in the same zip code as you, you're going to fall over and die. I can't stress enough just how bad the hit detection is in Contra Advance. It's really bad. And I'm sure a lot of that would have been alleviated if your character was a little smaller and more proportional to the size they are in, say, Contra III or Contra Hardcorps. Alright, we're getting ready to approach the final boss of the game. So this boss is very reminiscent of the final boss in arcade Super Contra. In that one, I also have a video comparing that with the NES port. You'll see that this comes at the end of a vertically scrolling overhead level, so the fight here is a little bit different. Again, this is much easier on the Game Boy Advance, but a big part of that is just because of playing on the hardest difficulty on the Super Nintendo. But look how much of the ground they cut off. You can't see pretty much any of the wall tiles, you just see the floor, that's it. And for the boss itself, it's much larger proportionally and occupies a lot more space. Once again, really emphasizing the claustrophobic feel of the Game Boy Advance port of this game. There we are. This boss is finished. So I guess that means we've beat the game now, right? Oh no. There's plenty more to go. Just wait and see how much more you've got to go through, especially in the Super Nintendo version here, on its high difficulty setting. So the brain boss, oh my goodness, so much worse in the Game Boy Advance version, again because of collision detection. It's a minor miracle that I haven't died on this form. And I saw most of the other forms, like the blue balls, and check me out on the Super Nintendo there. That may be the first time I've ever done that on the hard difficulty without dying. Meanwhile, on the Game Boy Advance, you only see this little walking form in this playthrough. And frankly, the reason for that is, I saw some of the other forms, but I died during every single other one, including the easiest one, which I'll tell you about in a minute. I got the eye form on the Game Boy Advance. This one's really easy, but I died in that version. They just hit me at a weird angle, and you can't see them well on the screen because of the proportion of the screen again. And here's the one with the little meat circles. You'll notice on the Super Nintendo, when I blow these things up, I can touch the brain. There's no collision detection between me and the brain when it's doing that attack. On the Game Boy Advance, if you come into contact with any part of the brain, you die immediately. So it takes the easiest form and makes it much more difficult. We're almost done here. I think I've got one left. Yeah, this will be the last one. Again, it wouldn't normally take this long. If we were playing this on normal difficulty, this fight would have been over quite a bit back. But there we are. So now surely that's the end, right? No more bosses. Whole thing's exploding? We must be done! Swell. But wait a minute. If you haven't played this game, or if you haven't played the Super Nintendo one on the hard difficulty, well, we've got one final thing to take out. And it's easy, but again, on Super Nintendo, you only get this boss when you're playing on hard, and you only get the entire ending when you're playing on hard. And it is not nearly as fearsome as it looks, which you will see in just a moment in both versions. As long as you've got a weapon other than basically your standard machine gun, it's very easy to take out in both versions. And the Game Boy Advance eliminates the flashing screen when the boss explodes. The explosions themselves are different. And if you look at the helicopter, in this area, but not in level 4, in this area, the rotors on the helicopter on Game Boy Advance are spinning super slow. How is that thing even moving? Look at that. And then watch it on the Super Nintendo. Much faster. Now the ending itself, as you can see here, is different in both versions. On the Game Boy Advance, we get sort of a tour of screenshots of all the bosses we fought and stuff. In the Super Nintendo original, we get pictures that are very similar to things that we saw in the original arcade Contra and Super Contra. These were on sort of the track screens that told you a bit of the story. And then we get a new one for Contra 3. That one is from Super Contra. So was the one right before it. And this is our new one for Contra 3. And of course we get our lovely, inspirational ending text telling us how great we are. Yes, and a lot of these endings, they sure do love to stroke the old egos, don't they? And now you can really see the difference in those propellers. Look how fast the ones are on the Super Nintendo and how slow they are on the Game Boy Advance. Interesting. And now, like I said, if you look back at level 4 at the footage for that, where on the helicopter, the rotor speeds are the same. So why did they slow them down here? I have no idea. Couldn't begin to guess. And once again, the ending music, sounds way better on Super Nintendo. It's not bad on the Game Boy Advance. I'm not going to trash the music on that one too much. I mean, it's not as good, no question about that, but it's not terrible. Now, one thing I will say that I kind of miss, were the overhead levels. They're not my favorite things ever, but if you've never played them on the Super Nintendo original, they're a little bit different than prior Contra games. So you start out with a direct overhead view of your character, and they're all mode 7, and the entire backgrounds rotate when you use the left and R buttons. The L and R buttons. Left and R? Why did I say that? Who knows? Anyway. And you can rotate faster if you double tap either of those left or R buttons. And you have to walk around the level destroying basically stationary bases. I may show you the whole game at some other point since you didn't get to see it here. And you'll get, to have a look at those yourself. So that's Stage 2 and Stage 5, and the bosses in those levels are pretty crazy also. And it's a shame that they were taken out of the Game Boy Advance one, because they just fit the game better than those levels from Hardcorps that they put in. There are some levels in Hardcorps that would have definitely worked better, like I said earlier. Just for example, maybe one of the levels where you're riding the speeder bikes or something, with the clouds, moving all in the air and sort of doing faux software scaling, for distance, and you get to see them disappear into the backgrounds and stuff. But anyway, that's the end. Let's do a conclusion here and wrap this thing up. Alright, so there we are, a complete comparison of Contra 3 and Contra Hardcorps compared to the much later Game Boy Advance game, Contra Advance The Alien Wars EX. My closing thoughts are, well, Contra Advance is really a pretty bad version of both Contra 3 and Contra Hardcorps. Like I said during the comparison, the characters are too large, the bullets are too large, the enemies fire at weird, consistent intervals, and they don't do that in either of the original games that it's based on. This game was just a huge, low-effort letdown. The dual weapon mechanic from Contra 3 was an important element of its gameplay. And in Contra Hardcorps, remember, you could switch between up to 4 different weapons, so being limited to just one really hurts. And then in Advance, you just get your one weapon, that's it, you can't switch to anything else, and losing bombs is also a pain since both Contra 3 and Contra Hardcorps had them. And the addition of the strafe button really doesn't add much. There's a couple of situations where it helps, but not many. I mean, Konami really took the low road here, and just slapped a lot of the graphics from the other games straight into Contra Advance without even changing them in any significant way for the lower GBA resolution. Now, they did modify a few backgrounds and enemies like I mentioned, but not many. The sound and music are alright in Contra Advance, but not great. They could have definitely been better. The songs don't sound anywhere near as good as the SNES originals, and this game came out at a time before developers figured out how to mix those multiple digital channels like I mentioned, so just being limited to the 2 sample channels and the standard Game Boy sound is why it doesn't sound as good as it could have. So is Contra Advance worth playing today? I've got to say, no, it's not. It is an exercise in frustration. It's worth taking a look at, sure, but hey, you just saw the whole game in the video, so you don't have to put yourself through that torture. Now, I said it during the comparison, and I'll say it again. The collision detection is the worst in the main series. If you look at an enemy wrong in this game, you fall over and die. And the performance issues we saw in some levels, particularly, the first 2 levels with the flame arc and the robot, and it happens a few other times, are just baffling. The GBA is a 32-bit system that is way more powerful than the SNES or Genesis. So why couldn't Konami get this game running as smoothly as it does on either of those platforms that came out in 1988 and 1990 respectively in Japan? Anyway, I've ranted enough. What do you all think? Have you played Contra Advance, the Alien Wars EX before? Was today your first time seeing it? Am I being too hard on it? Or maybe not hard enough? Tell me all about it in the comments. And that'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoy it, please toss it a like and share it online somewhere. If you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss one of my videos. If you want to support me or the work that I do here, I'd greatly appreciate it, and you can do that on Patreon or Ko-fi, or now through channel memberships right here on YouTube. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.